at the story of the Tower of Babel, where they say we want to make a name for ourselves.
Right.
And God says, no, that's not going to happen. In the very next chapter, in Genesis 12, God says to Abram, I will make your name great. He wants that for us, but he says, but do it this way, not in your own way. You can be a representative of the poor in lots of ways. I mean, this is the position that I've had, but not actually experience the pain and the marginalization.
Hi, I'm Susan Smetzer-Anderson, host of today's podcast. While I spend most of my time being the senior writer and content manager for the Stephen and Laurel Brown Foundation and Upper House, today I have the opportunity of speaking with Aaron White, whose insights about hospitality are deeply compelling. For the past 20 years, he and his family have been seeking to love and be loved by their neighbors in Vancouver's downtown Eastside. He has served at organizations like the Salvation Army, 24/7 Prayer, International Association for Refugees, and Westminster Theological Center. This year, he spoke at the Kingdom Justice Summit, which Upper House co-hosts with the Collaboration Project. Aaron is also the author of Recovering: From Brokenness and Addiction to Blessedness and Community. In addition to discussing what it looks like to be a true friend, which can be messy, but also truly life-saving, Aaron and I discuss what it means to show genuine hospitality to our neighbors and to live a life based on the Beatitudes, both of which can be challenging. At the end, I hope you will go deeper into the work that Aaron has done and find links to everything we discuss, including Aaron's talk at this year's Kingdom Justice Summit. Hope you enjoy this. So I loved your biography, partly because it gave me some sense of your passion and your heart, but what it lacked was telling to me as well, and that is you didn't go into your position, your status, your degrees. It's like you parsed all of that stuff out, and I wanted you to mention a little bit of your rationale for that, because I think that will tell us a lot about who you are.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this for a while, and I've been speaking in lots of different places for a lot of years, and I didn't even used to have a picture. I was back in the days when they said, please send a picture, and I didn't have a picture of myself. So a couple of different conferences, I sent a picture of Vin Diesel instead. And I think one conference in particular, they did use it. And so I think people were a little disappointed when they showed up to my talk.
Is that because of your rock and roll look, or?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, when I have a really big beard, when I don't have a big beard, I actually look a lot like Vin Diesel, weirdly. And I don't know if that's a compliment to me or an insult to him. But the bio thing, I'm just kind of over it. I think that we are playing the world's game when we are trying to show, here's why you should listen to me, because I've accomplished this and I've done that. When I look, one of the things I love to do when I introduce myself, particularly when I'm speaking, is I like to spend, if I have time to do it, the first 5 to 10 minutes talking about my grandmother and where she came from. Because when I look biblically at the introduction of people, often it's more, you're the son of and the daughter of, and you came from this tribe and this nation and this place.
It's true.
And that's how a lot of my Indigenous friends also introduce themselves. They don't talk about their accomplishments. They talk about their relationships.
Fascinating.
And so when you go and speak at these events, you're often really encouraged, or even pressured to say, here's why people should listen to me, is all these accomplishments. But I know enough people with enough accomplishments who I don't particularly want to listen to. I'd like to get to know somebody. So I try as much as I can in every way possible to subvert those expectations, because I don't think they're helpful. I think they're actually harmful to us as people, as individuals, as a presenter, as people listening, and as a whole culture. I don't think they're helpful.
Well, as I think about it, I think they're distancing, right?
Yeah.
They definitely elevate status, and they also create a sense of distance between yourself and the people you're actually wanting to connect with.
That's right.
And connection is a very big part of your discussion at KJS, and I'm assuming in your life, because you, in your bio, mentioned that you've moved to this neighborhood in Vancouver, which sounds like it's actually a pretty tough neighborhood, and that you're seeking not only to love, but to be loved by your neighbors. And that, to me, was so interesting, because I think we, at least in the conversations I've been a part of, talk about loving our neighbors and kind of as an act of charity, if you will. But to be loved by your neighbors takes it to a whole different level. So I'm wondering what your experience has been like in terms of establishing relationships as a Christian leader as well, that kind of takes it a deeper step than I think a lot of us really talk about in our church experience.
Well, you mentioned the word distancing, and quite often our degrees and our positions and our structures can just be inherently limiting and distancing. Even to the point where there are places where I've worked or I've known other people have worked where they say you have to sign a document saying you will not fraternize with people outside of the workplace. That is, you're working, say, in a shelter or in a detox or a treatment center or something like that, and you're helping people who are coming in, and you're genuinely helping people, but you have to sign a document saying you won't go out afterwards and have coffee with that person.
Right.
And I understand the reasons for that. I do, because I've seen it. I've seen abuse happen. I've seen manipulation happen. And there is an inherent power dynamic that exists. And we have to be really aware of that and really careful about those things. Absolutely. But I just choose not to live my life like that. I think those places and those ideas have to probably be there for now. But I would like us to try and be working our way out of those, because I've seen the most transformation happen in me when I have been open to somebody speaking into me. And that really doesn't happen when I'm in a service provider place and someone's in a client and reception of provision place. So we chose early on that we were going to try and be different. There was enough of that dynamic already in our neighborhood. So we're not against people who are giving out food, at all, but we would rather be in the place of in that lineup receiving the food than giving it out. When we do our meals in our local environment, we cook together and we eat together and we clean together to try and remove as much as possible that dynamic of person giving charity, person receiving charity, because we're all actually receiving. And that's, I think, the offer and the invitation from God is to receive and to give. And when we don't have that mindset, I think it becomes a patronizing, power dynamic relationship, which ultimately is not transformational. It's ultimately going to reinforce the same kinds of hierarchy and structure that has led to a real disconnection in our society.
Right. Well, you mentioned something really critical, which is the fact that we've all received charity, we've all received mercy, we've all received grace from this amazing God that we love. And do you think part of the reason that we rely so much, though, on status and accolades or whatever it is that we like to put in our resumes is because we don't really fully realize that?
I think we don't realize it, experience it, or trust it. So I think back to Genesis when the story of Cain and Abel, and Cain has killed his brother, and he has this interaction with God, and he says, you have to go, and Cain says, but they're going to kill me if I go. Whoever is out there is going to kill me. And God says, no, I'll put a mark on you. And we think now, this is how messed up we are. We think the mark of Cain is like this evil mark, but actually it's God's protection over Cain. He says, don't worry, I'll protect you. But Cain doesn't believe it. And Cain goes and builds a city. That's what it says. And there's a beautiful book by Jacques Ellul called The Meaning of the City, where he talks about every instance of the building of cities throughout Scripture until the very end, where it's not a positive thing. People are building these cities in order to try and create the kind of safety, in order to create the kind of provision, in order to create the name for themselves that God actually wants for us.
Mm.
There's the story of the Tower of Babel, where they say we want to make a name for ourselves.
Right.
And God says, no, that's not going to happen. In the very next chapter in Genesis 12, God says to Abram, I will make your name great.
Mm.
He wants that for us, but he says, but do it this way, not in your own way. And so
Right.
I think that a lot of those things are about protection, and it's about
Mm-hmm.
not ultimately trusting that
Mm-hmm.
God's love and mercy and hospitality to us is real. And so
Mm-hmm.
we feel we have to protect ourselves in it. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think it's a very big danger.
Right. And the idea of the city is also kind of aligned with the idea of a fortress. So we
Yeah,
cloak ourselves, we cloak our communities in these buildings, right?
right.
And these buildings become our point of contact, but aren't necessarily the point of relationship.
Yeah, and even more, it's our system, it's our buildings, but it's also our systems and our structures. It's our
Mm-hmm.
nonprofits, it's our charities, it's
Mm-hmm.
our boards, it's our
Mm.
organizational flow chart. It's
Mm-hmm.
our legacy that we're trying to leave. It's our
Mm-hmm.
fundraising. All these things exist, and I'm not saying they're inherently bad. I'm just saying
Right.
we have to be careful that we're not serving those things,
Mm-hmm.
because in the end, ultimately, and the experience of many, many people who have gone through helping programs
Mm-hmm.
is that ultimately the program exists to help the program, and
Ultimately,
incidentally
yeah.
it helps people, and it does.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
really, there's a lot of the policies and the programs exist in order to help the people running the programs, and so we have to be very careful around that stuff.
Well, and I think part of it too is in our country, you're in Vancouver, so I'm not sure how it is there, but here there's so much concern about liability.
Of course.
Like, are you going to be served a warrant or a court
Yeah.
order someday for something that you didn't even know was wrong
Yeah.
or had no intention of committing anyway?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of fear
Absolutely.
underlying a lot of these interactions. And I wonder if you could describe a little bit of your work with people who struggle with addiction.
Yeah. And it's funny even to talk about my work now with people. So I've been a pastor, and I've worked in treatment centers, and I've done a lot of that kind of thing. And now more the work that I do is people will call me and I'll go for a walk,
Oh.
and they will, lay out stuff that's going on in their heart, and I'll lay out stuff going on in my heart, and we'll kind of bless each other. Or, I brought a
Mm.
friend of mine to the Kingdom Justice Summit, and we ended up, because we got stuck in Dallas because of a certain airline that I won't mention. We ended up spending a
Yeah.
whole day of travel and a whole day stuck in the Dallas Fort Worth airport, and just spent
Mm-hmm.
time together and deepened our friendship.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when we have meals together, we may have up to 60 people having a meal together. But again, it's people have come in and they help cook the meal, and then they clean up, and
Okay.
it's a community.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we've discovered now is not that we don't need treatment programs, because treatment programs can be very, very good,
Mm-hmm.
very, very helpful, and we will
Mm-hmm.
help people get into those, and we'll walk alongside them in them, and we'll be
Mm-hmm.
there afterwards. But we have discovered quite a number of people who don't need a treatment program, because what they actually needed was connection. What they actually
Right.
needed was something to do in the day, and people to
Mm-hmm.
do it with, and people who knew them, knew their names, cared about them, and they might even still drink every now and again, but
Mm-hmm.
they're no longer enslaved to this thing, which was actually a replacement for the kind of connection that they longed for. So we've seen a number of people in that place
Right.
where it just looks different, because we're doing life together, and so some
Mm-hmm.
people really, really need a program. Other people just really,
Mm-hmm.
really need friends, and actually all of us really, really need friends.
That's
So my
correct.
focus now is far more on being that friend, because there's lots of programs and
Mm-hmm.
seemingly a shortage of friends. So
Right.
that's what I'm trying to do.
I agree with that completely. There was a quote that one of my colleagues brought up that he wrote down during your talk last weekend. He said, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection.
Hmm.
And what you're doing is living that out simply by eating together, taking walks together, doing dishes together.
Hmm.
Um, So, at what point did you decide that your call was to speak about this type of stuff? How did you become a speaker and a
Ugh.
writer talking about these things?
Yeah, I mean, I've been invited to do different types of speaking for probably the last 20 years.
Hmm.
And part of that was living where we live. And so
Hmm.
people were interested in that. And I think there was a lot of invitations that happened because people wanted to hear the war stories, the
Mm.
romanticized war stories of where we live.
Can you describe briefly what it's like where you live, what it is like?
Yeah, well, there's lots of phrases that are used to describe our neighborhood. Either, some people
Mm-hmm.
call it 10 square blocks of hell, poorest postal code in
Mm.
North America, that kind of stuff. But we really just call it home. It is,
Mm-hmm.
though, the
Yeah.
center of the most overdoses, I think, in North America on a regular
Wow.
basis. Incredible levels of poverty, but also incredible levels of gentrification. So
Oh.
people are homeless, and it's desperately
Mm.
poor here, and they can't afford a single room in our neighborhood because the prices have been jacked up. So it's just a whole
Yeah.
series of tensions and difficulties uh, in our neighborhood. So it can be quite difficult. And I will often, when I walk around in the neighborhood, find someone who looks like they might not be alive, and we have to go and make sure that the ambulance attends, and my children are in the same place. They have to make sure that people that they see, they know how to check if they're alive and what to do in the case that someone's not breathing, kind of thing. That's our
Mm-hmm.
neighborhood. So you hear that, and people go, "Well, I want to hear what you have to say." And again, I started to think, well, is that really a good reason to just listen to somebody? I wrote the books because I was asked, there was a group that wanted to put together a series on how to pastor well. And they wanted somebody who could write about how to pastor someone through addiction and recovery.
Mm.
And they wanted someone with a PhD, which I don't have. Um, but they couldn't find anybody with a PhD and also practical,
Jeez. Yeah.
pastoral engagement. I'm sure they're out there,
Uh-huh.
but they didn't, or maybe who could also write. So somebody knew me who knew somebody else, and so they asked if I would do it. So I said, I don't really want to write about just how to pastor a person through that. What I'd like to write about is how to create or be involved in the kind of beatitude community that Jesus invites us into, which
Mm-hmm.
actually might be the answer to those things that lie underneath addiction. And not just
Mm-hmm.
addiction to drugs and alcohol, but our whole attachment scenario to all kinds of things, whether it's
Right.
our political or our economic or our social or all kinds of things that we are attached to in really unhealthy ways. So how do we navigate through that? So
Mm-hmm.
that's a lot of how I've got to be, communicate and write.
So you mentioned something earlier about people liking to hear the horror stories. And I think that's actually something so common just anymore with our media always focusing on the worst. And we get kind of addicted to the vicarious, like, ooh, kind of experience of viewing those things. But can you speak to how you have developed really genuine relationships in your community and that feel natural to you, that aren't anything about you serving so much as just being the person you are with the people you're surrounded by?
Well, I say to my friends a lot, like, I'm your friend because you wanted to be my friend. There's
Mm-hmm.
lots of, I mean, I've met lots and lots of people, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
friendly with lots and lots of people,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not friends with lots and lots of people. So there are
Mm-hmm.
people who I've reached out to, or they reached out to me, and there was then a reciprocation, there was a mutuality. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes those started in kind of weird places, weird ways, and then eventually they turned into just genuine friendship. But
Mm-hmm.
I want to tell about a man I know named Tony, who he came down to the downtown east side, I think probably about 15 years ago. And he asked, what can I do? And we have lots and lots of people, Christians and non-Christians, coming to the
Mm-hmm.
downtown east side saying, what can I do? How can I
Right.
help? And they usually think, what can I give? How can I serve? All
Mm-hmm.
this kind of stuff. And I always say, and a number of us down here always say, could you make a friend?
Huh.
And mostly people go, yeah, yeah,
Wow.
yeah, yeah. But what can I also like really do? But
Mm-hmm.
Tony just said, oh, I can do that. And he just found a guy was a very difficult person to be friends with in a way, and just became his friend. And then for the next 15 years, he was his friend, and he would come down every day and he would find him and he would be his friend, take him everywhere. Whatever they did in the neighborhood, if Tony was helping serve food or whatever, his friend was there with him. He was
Wow.
always there with him until his friend passed away. And then he just really deeply mourned and lamented the loss of his friend. And that's not a story that you're going to write a book about. But that was a life-changing friendship for both of those men. And if we could just all do that, I'm not sure how many of the programs we would need. Because you fight differently for your friend. You advocate differently for your friend. You know, we got in trouble because we would bring our friends in to sometimes sleep on our couch, and we're told we can't do that for liability reasons. And my pushback was, well, it's my couch and it's my friend. Am I allowed to have my friend in my house? And I said, yeah, you are. I said, well, then what if they happen to be homeless? You know, like, are they allowed in here? So I think there's that level of you know, I think we all know what a friend is like. I hope. Maybe we don't. I don't know. But if we know that, then we just need to broaden the possibility of that inclusion, of that definition of friendship to people who aren't necessarily always like us in every way or fit some of the categories that we would normally associate with friends. And I think if we can do that, we can really start to transform our own lives and the lives around us.
Well, there's a difference between loving your neighbor kind of as an abstract concept, or like looking across the fence at somebody else, and like occasionally interacting with them and doing what you do, which is to invite somebody in to sleep on your couch, right? And I think about the way I was raised, which was that would not have ever happened. You know, safety was too big of a factor in our lives. And I'm wondering, what does it take for us to get over our fear of taking that risk? And how do we judge if it's a wise risk?
We've often said, when I do speak in churches or places, I don't say the first step is to go and find the person who's just come out of prison. Like, maybe that's
Yeah.
you know, there are, you know, well, I'll do that. But like, what I often give the challenge to is can you find somebody in your church who you don't know or maybe is lonely, and arrange to cook a meal with them? You know, and ideally sit down and say, what kind of food do you like, and can we go and buy the food together, and then we'll sit down and we'll cook the meal together and we'll eat it together. Just start there. Just start like building up our muscles for actual hospitality, which isn't a show. It's not performative. It's come and join with me. And then maybe next time we'll go over to your house and we'll do it that way. And you just start to learn. And then maybe after a little while, we'll invite another friend, you know, to come in and be part of that.
Right.
And it's, in some ways, it's quite sad that the church, that feels and often is received as quite revolutionary. When I think even though the church doesn't have a really great name right now for lots of reasons, say in the West, I think people would assume that that's what's already happening in the church, and is in many churches, of course. But you know, I think that's actually something we have to relearn, because we have become so beholden to the culture of individualism and separation and disconnection.
Exactly.
That, you know, we're not even we're agreeing with things that are not biblical and saying, well, that should take the highest priority, rather than saying, no, actually, this notion of kinship, this notion of my family extends beyond the nuclear, extends beyond the blood tie. You know, okay, what does that mean? How should we then live? I don't think we're actually letting ourselves be confronted by that invitation from Jesus into a better way of life. And it is a blessing. That's kind of the whole point, is that it's not a burden. It's not, oh, I got to do this duty. This is actually a good way to live. But we do have to lay down a lot of things in order to get there.
There's so many thoughts going through my head right now. One of them is a personal experience I had not too long ago, where I went to a friend's house, and she is such a model of hospitality to me. And, we had our talk and we were, eating her cheese and crackers and all of that. And then she looked at the time and goes, "Oh, I have somebody who's coming to stay with me. Can you help me make the bed?" And in that moment, I felt like I was really part of her life.
Mm-hmm.
It was so interesting to me. I'm like, this is like the best afternoon I've had in a long time. And it was because she invited me to do something that, well, I didn't expect it, for one thing, but mostly it was just because she invited me to be part of her messy, not so messy in a lot of ways, but into her real everyday experience. And there was no show involved. There was no like, everything in my world looks perfect and is perfect. It was just, this is who I am. This is what I need to do. Can you help me?
Mm-hmm.
And it just, in a way, deepened my relationship with her. Just doing that one simple thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like I'm making a big deal out of it, but it was really meaningful to me. So I really appreciate that suggestion of what can you do that makes it less about, I don't know, making a show out
Yeah.
of hospitality, which is, I think, what I was trained to do. Like, you have everything perfect, your house is perfectly cleaned, et cetera, et cetera. And there's so much bondage in that often I end up not inviting people over just because I don't want everybody to see the reality of my mess.
Yeah.
So, and Jesus is living with us in our mess all the time.
Mm-hmm.
The real person, the people who are making us feel like this, it's not God,
Mm-hmm.
it's self-imposed.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's one thought I had while you
Mm-hmm.
were talking. The other one I had was something I've been reading in Luke. I've been reading through Luke 14 the last couple of days, and Jesus is really challenging everybody in his presence about thinking carefully about what is real and what it takes to do the important things involved in following him, for example, which is to be mindful of the people around you, no matter where you are, and to build your life wisely and thoughtfully and not to just do things on automatic pilot. That is my very poor, summary, which we can redo later if you want to. But I'd ask you to comment on what I'm going to read here. He's at a meal with the Pharisees, and he's obviously being carefully watched. And he's observing people taking the higher places at the table and trying to position themselves in this social gathering. And he very directly says to the host, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And I think you're kind of filling out what Jesus is intending here with the way you talk about hospitality, but is that part of your thinking as well, that Jesus invites us to think about everybody around us?
Yeah. And I mean, I think anytime Jesus is using parabolic or metaphorical language, in this case, it's
Mm-hmm.
just an example, but
Mm-hmm.
he's speaking about himself as well.
Mm-hmm.
So this is part, I think this is part of the story of who am I inviting?
Mm-hmm.
Who is being invited in? And we have number of stories from Jesus's life where he said, I'm inviting the really unlikely here. I'm inviting
Mm-hmm.
the ones who don't expect the invitation. I'm inviting the ones who
Mm-hmm.
know that they can't host a feast in return. And so, you
Mm-hmm.
can read that passage a little bit and go, well, I guess we shouldn't have our friends over. You should just do the charity meal. You should do the soup kitchen kind of thing. And I don't think that's what's going on there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, don't just be caught up in this this tit for tat kind of, that
Mm-hmm.
it becomes almost a social climbing,
Mm-hmm.
socially expected kind of dinner party thing. And Jesus, like, that's not even what God is doing here. God is not doing
Mm-hmm.
the thing that you expect.
Mm-hmm.
God is opening things up to the people who really have been, kept out. I was reading the other day this passage where Jesus, meets the lepers, and
Mm-hmm.
and he says to the leper after he heals him, "Don't tell anybody." And the leper, of
Right.
course, goes and tells everybody. And I hadn't realized this before. This was a new revelation that uh, the leper was finally able to go into the town, because he would have
Right.
been kept out of the town. So Jesus's healing of this man was social and spiritual and physical.
Mm-hmm.
There's every level of connection. But
Mm-hmm.
because this leper went into the town and disobeyed and told everybody about Jesus, now
Mm-hmm.
it says, the next line says, and Jesus now couldn't enter the towns.
Right.
I had always taken that as, well, he became too famous, but actually it was because he interacted with the leper. And so now he was
Mm. Oh, that's
carrying
fascinating.
the stain of leprosy, that he wouldn't have been allowed to
Right.
go into these towns as well, because
Fascinating.
he was so close. It's like the story of the woman with the flow of blood, who
Right.
Jesus is on his way to go and heal somebody, and she touches
Mm-hmm.
him. And she doesn't
Mm-hmm.
want to say that she touched him, because she's actually made Rabbi Jesus unclean now. And he
Right.
can't go to the house of the head of the synagogue
Mm-hmm.
now. Like, that would be an unclean thing to do, but he does. But, it's so he's doing this opposite thing, that the people who would think of themselves as unclean and were thought of as unclean, he said, actually, I want
Right.
them as close as possible. And so I
Yeah.
think that's part of the blessing. And
Uh-huh.
as I look through, and my book is really about the Beatitudes, and Jesus's invitation into his Beatitude life
Mm-hmm.
begins with that poverty of spirit, that
Mm-hmm.
intentional awareness of humility. I
Mm-hmm.
can't do this, and finding
Mm-hmm.
yourself in the position of the one who can't. But
Mm-hmm.
Jesus says, but I invite you in, and that's blessed. And it's
Mm-hmm.
very difficult for us who've been in a place of privilege and power for a long time to actually
Mm-hmm.
adopt that posture.
Well, and I wonder if, for example, when I think about the descriptors here, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, in some ways we are all poor, crippled, lame, and blind. It's just that those afflictions that we carry are often covered up,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't really openly display them. So maybe taking the position that this is me, this is my reality, this levels the playing field
Yeah,
in a radical way.
it does. And there are genuine socioeconomic realities
Oh,
where I
certainly.
can walk
Yes.
into anywhere. But if I genuinely attach myself
Mm-hmm.
to those who are poor, to those who are in those places, then it becomes more difficult for me to be
Hmm.
invited into those places. And you
Hmm.
start to begin to feel that level of ostracization and
Huh.
marginalization. And that's actually a really important thing as well. Because we can spiritualize this
Mm-hmm.
poverty, and there's a truth,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely true what you say.
Mm-hmm.
But we still also know still have the city walls around us, you know.
Right.
So
Right.
actually going into those relationships with
Uh-huh.
people, that can start to shift things in really uncomfortable ways that
Uh-huh.
open us up to the reality of, like, okay, well, Jesus hanging out with a leper meant that he was treated like a leper. So
Mm.
if you're going to hang out with a criminal, then there are
Mm-hmm.
going to be people who will view you in that light. If you're going to hang out with
Interesting.
women who are in sex work, then you're going to be perhaps seen in that light. If you're going to hang out with, I don't know, Democrats or Republicans or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
whatever the opposite is,
Mm-hmm.
that's how you're going to start to be viewed, and you'll start to be pushed away. And that's
Hmm.
actually kind of an important, end result of the Beatitudes, is blessed are you who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what's going to happen. That's what happens to peacemakers. And
Mm-hmm.
so you will find yourself in those places for real.
I appreciate your saying that. That's actually not something I had thought about.
Mm.
And I'm wondering, if that took you by surprise when that happened to you.
I knew that theoretically. I had read enough to know
Mm-hmm.
that was,
Mm-hmm.
in theory, the true thing that would happen.
Mm-hmm.
However, being in a place of position and power, you
Mm-hmm.
can insulate yourself from that an awful lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you can also still have all the stories told about you and all the stories to carry around to great places.
Mm-hmm.
And you can be a representative of the poor in lots of ways. I mean, this is the position that I've
Mm-hmm.
had, but not actually experience the pain and
Right.
the marginalization. And
Mm-hmm.
so, when you actually face it, like, it's not fun, it's not good. And I've had little bits and little places here and there, and I still think there are all kinds of ways that I haven't accepted that full invitation into the poverty of spirit,
Mm-hmm.
or as Jesus says in Luke, just blessed are the poor.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't say poor of spirit. That I'm still learning, and
Mm-hmm.
it's still very, very hard.
I don't think I ever really thought of Jesus as inviting me to rethink my position in this world as radically as you just suggested.
Mm,
I don't think I've ever been exposed to a message that is quite that demanding,
mm,
if you will. And that has radical implications. I
yeah.
mean, I think about the people who've given up their all for Jesus and say gone off to missionary work in far off places and live in really tough spaces and do things that I look at and go, I have no idea how they did that. But what you're talking about is something that is more rooted here and now, and how would I live in this culture where there is definitely a big division between the haves and have-nots? As this fairly highly educated woman who has this bank account that isn't huge but is safe, and really think about how would Jesus invite me to go further in being radically committed to him and not afraid of
Hmm.
making changes.
Hmm.
That's what your comments just prompted in me, and quite honestly, it's very challenging.
Well, and to me too. I like
Mm-hmm.
to be very careful to say that the anything I say that people receive as challenging, I've either
Mm-hmm.
been wrestling with it, or am still
Mm-hmm.
wrestling with it, or still need to
Mm-hmm.
wrestle with it, because it's never quite done. We've put
Mm-hmm.
together, of course, my friend Danielle and I put together a course called The Creative Way Down,
Mm-hmm.
which is all through the
Mm-hmm.
Beatitudes, and it's an attempt to say how do we follow Jesus downwards
Mm-hmm.
into blessing.
Mm-hmm.
And what we discover in the Beatitudes is the first Beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The last Beatitude is, blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It's the same blessing. And it sort of starts in the same place that it ends. And so we figure,
Mm-hmm.
oh, that probably means that it doesn't end. It's actually a spiral that you just keep on going and keep on going and keep on going deeper into the heart
Mm-hmm.
of Jesus, into the invitation of blessing.
Mm-hmm.
And that blessing, the word is makarios, and it actually suggests risen from the dead or united with Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This is really an invitation not into just a socioeconomic reality.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're talking about that, then we could say, well, it could be socialism, Marxism, whatever. There's lots of different socioeconomic systems that we could try and pursue, but they're also not the fullness, because it's actually located in this person who is God, who
Right.
says, come into
Mm-hmm.
my life and find it blessed. And
Mm-hmm.
actually it's not a burden, because my burden is genuinely light. So come and find yourself in this place where I'm offering you this liberation and freedom. But it is going to be challenging, because it does run in the face of everything, all the commitments that we've made in this world.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
that
that
includes
we've
person. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking all the quick commitments that we've been shown are important,
That's right.
that are the priorities
Yeah.
for, people with opportunities. And so it's a radical reshifting of how we view what real life is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can
Yeah.
can you repeat the name of your course? I'd
Yeah.
love to know more about it.
It's called The Creative Way Down. and it is a 3-month course every day. So there's a video every week where I do some teaching,
Mm.
and then every single day there's some written content and practices to help people go deeper into this beatitude life. And you do that usually in a group, in a cohort,
Mm-hmm.
where you try and go deeper and deeper and deeper. And it's when I find people who said, I've done the whole course, I go, I'm so sorry. Because it is very intentional, and it is very intense, because
Mm.
and it's meant to be. It's intentionally that to
Mm-hmm.
say we probably need some cold water to wake us up to the beauty that Jesus is offering us, but we've been
Mm-hmm.
so comfortably numbed in
Mm.
the world that it exists. And
Mm-hmm.
part of what I was saying at the Justice Summit was, my hope a little bit is that with some of even the stats that I mentioned, the fentanyl crisis and so on, it might wake us up to the reality that this is life and death stuff.
Yeah.
And the medicine that we seem to be offering, which we
Mm-hmm.
should have as the church, it doesn't seem to be strong enough for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe we're not properly understanding or applying that medicine. Maybe we haven't fully received it, because
Mm-hmm.
it seems like this should be the kind of thing that will help.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's my hope for myself and for my community, my family, and anyone I speak to, is that we
Mm-hmm.
would see the beauty of this, so that it's the kind of thing we could offer to others.
And what you're talking about is the beauty of the beatitude life.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah. And one more question I have about your course is this a course that is best done with a group of people who are all trying to figure this out, so you can kind of talk about it and the implications and hold each other accountable, or
Mm-hmm.
support each other through it?
Very much so. People, they do it in groups. There's also an offer that a group we're part of will kind of lead a cohort through, like help facilitate a cohort
Mm-hmm.
through. And there are some individuals who've done it, but I don't necessarily recommend that, because
Mm-hmm.
there is an awful lot of accountability required in this. So
Mm-hmm.
it is
Mm-hmm.
best to do this in a group of people who are spiritually hungry. And I'll say
Yeah.
this too, one of the reasons we do this, and that I try and live the way I live, is I'm kind of tired
Mm.
of being in groups of people and trying to convince them. And this
Mm-hmm.
often happens in the church, trying to convince them of the
Mm-hmm.
goodness of this. So if I can find a
Mm-hmm.
group of people who are already spiritually hungry, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't particularly care if they're Christians yet or at all,
Mm-hmm.
then
Mm-hmm.
that's who I want to work with. And
Mm-hmm.
there are non-Christians who've taken this course and just, met Jesus in the
Wow.
midst of this, quite challenging beatitude
Right.
invitation.
Right.
So it's got to be with people who are hungry for this.
Yeah.
Something more.
I totally understand that. And the prayer is, quite honestly, that the Holy Spirit will lead us to find those people.
Yeah.
So that we can support one another and kind of admit, I feel still like I only know a teeny tiny bit of what it is to really follow Jesus, and to really understand the grace of God and his deep, deep compassion for me in this world.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate what you're saying, and I deeply appreciate your honest sharing. I feel like I could have several more conversations with you and learn and be really touched and challenged in a good way. So thank you so much for spending time with us today and for sharing what you did at Kingdom Justice Summit. Highly encourage folks to check out your talk there. And blessings on you and your journey.